Hi, my name is Michael Godek. I'm from Seguin, Texas, a little town just east of San Antonio. While we're waiting for the folks to wander into the session, a little preamble. My first Drupal camp was in Austin in 2009, which was the same year that AWS EC2 debuted in Europe. I remember the buzz at that camp about how EC2 was a game changer for the small agency, and man, they weren't wrong. There was a guy, Josh Koning, who was there talking about a thing he called Pantheon hosting, giving his standing on the shoulder of giants speech, which some of you have probably heard along the lines. It was a humble Drupal beginnings. Pantheon now has a $1 billion valuation last time I checked, so not bad. So Drupal has stood up well over the last decade. It had its existential crisis between Drupal 7 and Drupal 8, but it came out well, and it's a competitive content management offering today as it moves to Drupal 10, even as the front-end work gives way to the likes of Gatsby, Nuxt, and Hugo. Drupal has its solid place. My first DrupalCon was in 2010 in San Francisco, the year when an Icelandic volcano shut the Europeans out. I went on to attend DrupalCons in Chicago, Prague, Munich, Sydney, Austin, Amsterdam, and Baltimore. Drupal South Melbourne and Drupal Europe in Darmstadt, Germany. Awesome experience. It's always been an outstanding community of practice. Drupal events have been some of the best professional experiences of my years in software development, and I'm proud to have the opportunity to speak with you here today. The dawn of the 21st century saw a troubled software industry redeemed by a simple and humble manifesto of agility. 20 years later, when we look at what Agile has become, it calls to mind Richard Feynman, who at a 1974 Caltech commencement speech coined the term cargo cult science. You've probably all heard some version of the origin story. Because of a unique quirk of geography on the island of Papua New Guinea, a sizable population remained isolated from the rest of humanity up until the age of airplanes found them out. Coastal seafaring outposts on the Papua New Guinea coast had always been connected with the Austronesian cultural spread across the Pacifics, but swamps protected the rugged approaches to the central highlands. The peoples of the highlands developed a unique way of understanding the world, undisturbed by the ideas of the rest of humanity. The first pilots exploring this area, the size of the state of California, expected an uninhabited expanse, but were shocked and amazed to find networks of fortified villages surrounded by neatly cultivated sweet potato and sugarcane fields, a robust society hidden in the highlands. The Second World War followed quickly on the heels of first contact, with makeshift airfields springing up in the midst of a decidedly untechnological culture. Supplies such as bottled beer and canned peaches, knives, and shovels fell into the curious and delighted hands of the pre-industrial locals. When the airfields were abandoned, the locals knew not why and wanted more of the stuff. They were as intelligent as any humans anywhere, and they tried to discover how to make the planes full of stuff come back. And this next part is directly from Feynman's commencement speech. He said, "During the war, they saw airplanes with lots of good materials, and they want the same thing to happen now. So they've arranged to make things like runways, to put fires along the sides of runways, to make a wooden hut for a man to sit in with 2 wooden pieces on his head for headphones and bars of bamboo sticking out like antennas. He's the controller, and they wait for the airplanes to land. They're doing everything right. The form is perfect. It looks exactly the way it looked before, but it doesn't work. No airplanes land. So I call these things cargo cult science because they follow all the apparent precepts and forms of scientific investigation, but they're missing something essential because the planes don't land." And 2 decades into the age of Agile, getting the planes to land is still sometimes harder than we'd like. We substitute ceremony and ritualistic imitation of forms, practices that go through the motions, implementing the Spotify model, imitating Netflix, preaching best practices as something that seemed to have worked somewhere else. We light fires along the runway and stand up story points like bamboo antennas, while neglecting and even resisting the effort to correlate actual practices with meaningful outcomes. Cargo cult Agile. Agilists often feel justified in this practice by the equally ungrounded budget and forecasting processes by which work is funded, where targets and milestones hold the ground where you might otherwise expect to find some common sense. Our goal is to give you some idea about how to bring development activities in line with business purpose by substituting predictability of outcome for milestones and due dates. Improved predictability of outcome is the common ground for both teams and stakeholders to move away from targets and deadlines and to adopt more effective ways of evaluating the costs of proposed work. Troy McGinnis said, "Agilists must accept the need for revenue and budget forecasts to be taken seriously." People who say, "Estimates don't have value because you can't predict the future," are just not thinking about the question very deeply. While it's true that most target and milestone-focused estimation practices isn't helping anybody predict any future, but it doesn't follow that not estimating is somehow a solution. To move the conversation forward, we need to recognize that the nature of the problem is our uncertainty about proposed work, and that the solution lies in understanding concepts and techniques to incrementally reduce uncertainty early and often. At the center of the discussion is some basic math. Nothing hard, just a basic understanding of measurement scales and how they work. Now, 30 years ago, one of my first consulting gigs was to build an estimation system for an electrical contractor. My task was to implement his procedures in what he called an electronic spreadsheet. My client taught me his procedures, which I modeled in Borland Quattro Pro. My client taught me that the mistake that almost everybody makes is to think that the estimate is about costs. "The estimate is more like a map," he said. "The costs mark out the terrain. You need a map to not get lost in the middle of the work." While I was working on that project, trying to unpack what he meant by that, there was a story in the news that made a big impression on me: the bankruptcy of the largest construction firm in Vermont. I knew some of these guys, a multi-generational family business that went up in smoke over a single bid. It was the Northfield Elementary School re-roofing project. The estimator was an expert. He'd done a lot of these projects. He did his due diligence. He walked the roof for inspection before writing up his bid. What he missed was just how many times the roof had been resurfaced over the years with layers of tar and gravel, all hidden below the surface. The removal of the old roof was included in the fixed bid, and as it turned out, the cost of tearing up and disposing the tons of old hardened tar and gravel ran into the millions. Ever since then, whenever I've been asked for an estimate, I can't help but think of that poor guy standing up on the rooftop, unaware that he was about to bring his company down. Mark Twain had said, "It's not what you don't know that'll hurt you, but what you know that ain't so." In other words, your downfall will likely be in false assumptions that you don't sufficiently explore. So I've been thinking about this for a long time, but it's only recently that I discovered how to leverage uncertainty in estimation or no estimation, and that's what I wanted to share with you here today. Project managers and developers are routinely asked to navigate ambiguity, such as being asked to produce an estimate against some hazy business objectives or making firm commitments against obviously changing scope. A common refrain we hear is, "The problem with estimating is that it's dependent upon having all of the facts ahead of time." Now, the problem with that attitude is it equates certainty with estimating. We're going to go over how to make uncertainty your friend in this process. We overemphasize precision from the get-go when we ask for a single value. How long do you need for this story? A discrete value is a precise value, whereas certainty is imprecise. As simple as it sounds, asking for a discrete value puts the pressure on to look past all the things that you don't know. "You're the expert, right? You should know these things. How long do you need for this?" When we're working with discrete value estimates, we need to understand the implications of how assumptions are handled. We expect that after the work is done, the actual cost will turn out to be different from the estimate because we know that there are factors that we didn't know about or we can't control, which will affect the outcome. So as we estimate, we substitute these unknowns with assumptions on what they might turn out to be. For example, if we're estimating a story that's built around an unfamiliar third-party API, We know that there's risk, but we don't know where. It's supposed to be a RESTful API, but who knows? When providing a discrete value estimate, we increase the size of the estimate to accommodate uncertainty and complexity. The amount of increase becomes an implicit component of the estimate representing our assumption about the nature of that risk. When we inflate our estimate to accommodate risk and uncertainty, it becomes hard to know what part is how long we think it'll take and what part represents contingency for various assumptions which may or may not play out. Instead of lumping assumptions in with effort estimates, we can make it easier to keep track of risk and uncertainty by expressing our estimate as a range that will most likely contain the eventual value. The difference is significant because a range estimate allows you to quantify what you're uncertain about. Using range estimates gives us a much more powerful way to express uncertainty than bundled assumptions because you don't have to commit to anything you're not sure of. The range and probability reflect your uncertainty. If you have no clue, then you just widen the range until it reflects what you do know. In contrast to tarballing assumptions into a discrete estimate, a range makes your uncertainty evident, leaving it exposed for ongoing, even iterative reevaluation. So the essence of estimation is an iterative process of reducing your uncertainty about something that matters. Reducing uncertainty is a question of first working out what you're uncertain about. Decomposition. Break down the question, classify, compare, discriminate, distinguish, and so on, until you can reason about the components independently, and then ask, what are the possible outcomes? What decisions would be affected by additional information? Now, for example, maybe one of the things that you're uncertain about in the supposedly RESTful API is error handling. It matters because you expect errors to be reported as 400 responses. But if you find yourself in the middle of work sorting through 200 responses looking for embedded error messages, then it's all going to take more time. Instead of adding days to the component of work until you figure out what you're actually dealing with, you widen the range until you feel confident that the actual effort will fall somewhere in that range, regardless how the question plays out. Range estimation doesn't have to take any more time. You're just expressing things differently. If range estimation results in a greater comprehension of uncertainty, and you spend more time on estimation to reduce that uncertainty, then we'll take that as a good thing. If actual uncertainty results in a range that's too wide for comfort, then you figure out what questions, if you had the answers, would reduce your uncertainty. Uncertainty is reduced by obtaining new information by means of observations about those questions. When observations are expressed quantitatively, that constitutes a measurement. Thus, a measurement is a quantitatively expressed reduction of uncertainty based on observations. Now, if that sounds like a mouthful, here's a more precise way of saying the same thing from a 1948 paper called A Mathematical Theory of Communication by Bell Labs researcher Claude Shannon. Shannon postulated that information is the amount of uncertainty reduction in a signal. Shannon's conception of information as uncertainty reduction was fundamental to everything that we understand as information theory. The advent of signal processing, the development of integrated circuits, and a lot that followed from that. Thinking of information as uncertainty reduction opens us up to a world of measurement where uncertain values are first-class citizens, where we can more easily take into consideration intangibles which we once dismissed as not subject to precise measurement. Shannon referred to the reduction of uncertainty as the removal of entropy from the thing being measured relative to its prior state. An iterative process of uncertainty reduction increases the fidelity of the signal. Now, a definition of information entropy is that it's the average amount of information conveyed by an event when considering all possible outcomes. When you toss two coins, the information entropy is the base 2 logarithm of the number of possible outcomes. 2 coins, 4 possible outcomes, 2 bits of entropy. The basic idea of information theory is that the more one knows about a topic, the less new information one is apt to get about it, the fidelity of the signal. The converse is what I refer to as leveraging uncertainty in estimation. The less one knows about the possible outcome of a topic, the easier it is to obtain new information that will reduce uncertainty. So given the concept of estimation as uncertainty reduction, we use ranges to model the fidelity of the signal, a tight range indicating a high fidelity, a wide range low fidelity, working incrementally to resolve questions to reduce entropy. Each time we narrow our range based on new information, we increase the fidelity of our signal. New information comes as observations, answers to questions that we express quantitatively. Mostly when we think of estimation, we think of how much time or money will be needed, but we commonly use other ways and other scales to help estimate. And it's important to know when and how to use different scales. In 1946, 2 years before Shannon's A Mathematical Theory of Communication, an American psychologist named Stanley Smith Stevens published a paper called On the Theory of Scales and Measurements, in which he defined a taxonomy of measurement methods. Stevens' vocabulary of measurement scales include nominal, ordinal, rational, and interval scales. Now, the concept of the scales existed well before Stanley Smith Stevens' taxonomy, but the taxonomy was revolutionary because it put measurement scales into a comparative taxonomy where we could look at them and rationalize about why we're using one scale or another in a particular circumstance. So let's walk through them. Rational scales are your ordered sets that support addition, subtraction, multiplication, and division. Time and money are rational scales that you use every day. You can roll up a group of time estimates to a single value and know that 2 times that value is twice as long. But you knew that already. Interval scales are ordered sets like rational scales, except that there's no fixed zero, such as the Celsius temperature scale, where 0 doesn't indicate an absence of temperature. It's effectively an arbitrary point on the scale. It's the point where water freezes. Well, it's actually the point where low salinity water freezes at sea level, right? If you change the operational definition of freezing, if it's at 3,000 meters elevation, if the salinity is different, then water doesn't freeze at 0 centigrade. So it's an arbitrary point on the scale, but it's not the absence of temperature. The way you think of in terms of 0 on a rational scale, 0 money is the absence of money, which is a lot different than 0 centigrade, which is not the absence of temperature. So interval scales are awesome because they allow us to measure things relative to other things, which brings us to the interval scale that you're all familiar with in some way is story points. Story points is interval scale math. So to understand story points, imagine for a moment that we give up our cherished career in software engineering for one in landscaping. We find that it takes us 30 minutes to mow a half-acre lot. Then we can say with confidence that it should take 2 hours to mow a 2-acre lot, right? We could assign 3 mowing points to the half-acre lot, and then we'd know that the 2-acre lot should be 12 mowing points. The beauty of this method is that it disassociates time and effort. If we get a faster mower and it takes us only 20 minutes to mow a half acre, then we can apply our mowing points to recalculate that it should take 80 minutes to mow the 2 acres. From social sciences to pharmacology, scientists create new interval scales every day, simply by identifying a baseline value of something that they're studying and call it 1, and then they measure other things of the same class relative to that 1. That's the way that story points are supposed to work, by baselining a small story and then sizing other stories relative to the established baseline. If the team doesn't agree on a baseline story, then everything that follows is not interval math. It's not rational scale math. It's neither fish nor fowl nor good red herring. Ordinal scales are ordered sets, but you don't know how much more one value is than another. Mohs scale of mineral hardness tells us that one rock is harder than another, but not by how much. You can say that granite is harder than sandstone, but the scale doesn't say anything about how much harder one set member is than another. There's no roll-ups in ordinals. Consider a 5-star rating system. Is watching 5 one-star movies the same amount of fun as watching one 5-star movie? Now, t-shirt sizes are the ordinals that you're all deeply familiar with. And it's an ordinal scale that's very frequently conflated with a rational scale. When the sizes are assigned rational scale values, such as 3 days for medium, so that the sizes can be rolled up into totals, it's mixing two different scales, and ignoring the properties of the measurement scales in this way actually introduces ambiguity rather than resolves it. So this problem is so pervasive in software at this point and is in software practice that a simple ordinal scale was developed specifically to avoid this problem, proposed by Alistair Cockburn, with set members of cherry pit, peach cobbler, Mustang, and Brontosaurus. The Cockburn ordinal scale is ideal for backlog refinement. Right? Everybody gets cherry pit. Nobody in their right mind is going to try to figure out how many peach cobblers will fit in a Mustang. There's no ambiguity about Brontosaurus, which is any story that's too big to go into work. It may seem whimsical, but the Cockburn scale leaves little opportunity for conversion to rational scale time, and it keeps the focus on story decomposition. Now, the OWASP Cybersecurity Risk Assessment Scale is a good example of a bad use of an ordinal scale. OWASP asks you to classify cybersecurity risk as either low, medium, or high. But consider if we simply relabel low, medium, and high as cherry pit, peach cobbler, and Tyrannosaurus rex. For an evaluation of cybersecurity risk, it's not the same as Cockburn's Brontosaurus. It definitely matters how much bigger one Tyrannosaurus rex is from another. So the choice of measurement scale should be appropriate to support the decisions that matter. The scale should allow you to quantify what's actually at risk in this case. And there's a lot of difference between 1 million and 1 billion, although both would be high. So our final scale in Stanley Smith-Stevens set is nominal scales, which are unordered sets of attributes. Essentially, you're testing set membership. Having no quantitative value, you can't roll up nominals because each attribute is either true or false. Thus, nominal scales support making qualitative measurements. Now, there are as many nominal scales as there are qualities of things in the universe, so you have a lot to choose from. But one that's commonly found, that I've found to be very effective in software backlog refinement, is INVEST, which stands for is your story independent, negotiable, valuable, estimable, small, and testable. So there's screening attributes, and your story should test positive for each one of those attributes before it gets screened into technical planning. And the one that people wonder about a lot is what does negotiable mean? And that really is asking if the story's overspecified. When a story is overspecified too early, then it's really not negotiable, right? It should be, the business objective should be specified by that point, and then leaving the team some latitude to figure out the appropriate implementation. Now, nominal scales are testing set membership, so it's a binary question, either true or false for a set member, but our certainty is usually something less than binary. So we can still quantify our uncertainty about binary questions by stating our confidence in a range of 50 to 100%. A 50% confidence means you have no idea. Do a coin toss. You can't be any less certain than that. Setting confidence intervals on binary questions shows us that even though they're qualitative attributes, they can be quantified. And it helps us to identify what new information might increase our understanding of the work, makes our uncertainty explicit and persistent for reevaluation. So the concept of a good estimate is a high fidelity signal. Ranges allow us to model signal fidelity and to concentrate on incrementally increasing fidelity by reducing uncertainty. We try to resolve uncertainty by asking what questions, if we had the answers, would reduce uncertainty. We answer those questions by means of observations. We refine stories by qualifying observations according to appropriate measurement methods, rational, interval, ordinal, nominal scales, modeling the answers. A common outcome of refinement, of course, is further decomposition. Story splitting can be greatly aided by systematic evaluations of qualities along the lines of the invest attributes or a checklist of your own discerning. Refinement proceeds through an iterative process of decomposition and reevaluation. So you'll have noticed by now that no estimates in the sense is really just estimation by means of measurement scales other than rational scale time. So we can't end without addressing this question of why is software estimation so difficult? In the physical infrastructure world, mega project failures make the headlines, but skyscrapers, bridges, ports, factories are routinely delivered in budget. The urbanized world around us stands in evidence that physical domain estimation practices basically work. Building a 30-story office building involves a lot of complexity. There's a lot that can go wrong, but still, large building projects routinely deliver on time and on schedule. Software projects with comparable budgets rarely do. Why is that? The key to understanding why estimating software and services is so different is in the possible acceptable outcomes. For all the things that can go wrong in the construction of a large building, there's very little variation in possible acceptable outcomes. You still have to have the building at the end, or it's not an acceptable outcome. For software systems, there's almost always a multiplicity of possible acceptable outcomes, even leaving aside the unacceptable outcomes. So recall Shannon's definition of entropy, the amount of information conveyed by an event considering all of the possible outcomes. The amount of entropy of a software project is far, far greater than the amount of entropy in a physical building project of comparable cost. The multiplicity of possible acceptable outcomes means that finding one of the paths to a successful outcome depends on an ongoing, interactive, iterative identification of uncertainty and a systematic reduction of entropy. Taking the math of measurement scale seriously is what's really going to separate the geeks from the cargo culters. We will get so much more value out of the process by respecting the math. Screen stories with a simple ordinal scale. Use the Cockburn scale if you need to keep honest about it. Ask nominal scale questions such as the invest checklist or one of your own making as part of the screening. Do the simple things first, the ordinal and qualitative nominal scale estimates first, and let actual uncertainty drive how deep you need to go. And don't go any deeper than you need to. Stakeholders are going to need substantive information about how resources are being used, and improved predictability of outcome is the common ground for both teams and stakeholders to move away from targets and deadlines to adopt more effective ways of evaluating the costs of proposed work. It's only reasonable that the budget be the voice of the customer. So some of the most important work that we have to do before us in software is to strip away the apparent complexity around what we mean by predictability and productivity in software and services, including how to measure it, and put those things, those metrics in alignment from the pull request edge all the way through to the profit and loss statement. When stakeholders are asked to trust the iterative approach implied by Agile, they should also have access to meaningful and up-to-date information about costs and process analytics. Just keeping track of how much money is spent is not enough. Dubious metrics such as velocity only obscure the question. Agilists need to demonstrate responsible use of resources provided, including systematic feedback needed to keep budget allocation in alignment with how resources are actually needed and used. So thank you very much for joining me today and walking through this. There's so much more to talk about. So let's continue the conversation. You can contact me directly through my website, www.michaelgodek.com. There's contact information there, LinkedIn and Twitter, and the contact form. There's a bibliography there with many of the books that I went through and resources in developing this material. And I'll reference at the very least Doug Hubbard's How to Measure Anything, and many other books that fed into this. I'll be speaking at Kanban Summit in San Diego in March of 2022. I'd be looking forward to Kanban Global Summit under any circumstances, but this stands to be a live event, And if you're anything like me, I spent the last 18 months, have hardly gone anywhere. I'm really looking forward to getting out and talking to people and all the things that we do at conferences that we haven't been able to do over these last 18 months. So please reach out. Let's continue the conversation and go buy your ticket for Kanban Global Summit. Thanks.